Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we're talking counter meta, specifically how to counter all of the top decks in the current metagame right now. A4 just released like a week ago, and the first tournament, the first large tournament of the first weekend here really did show that, traditional decks that were tried and tested and proven are, of course, still really strong. That's often the case early on in the metagame. Things like Giratina Darkrai, like Buzzwole, even things like Sylveon and Greninja, a lot of people are still playing. Guzzlord is running around, Flareon, Leafeon. A lot of the old decks are still some of the best decks in the entire game. Things have been changed, things have been updated, but there are a couple new players into the metagame that has shaken things up a little bit. This video, we're going to go through each of the most played decks or the best decks in the meta right now, and we're going to talk about the best ways to counter those decks, specifically what decks you should be playing that have specifically really high win rates against all of those most common deck lists. That's what this video is really all about. Hopefully this is, something that is useful to you guys, but also maybe a little bit interesting. We're going to be going through a decent amount of data, but I'm actually going to be doing this video maybe a little bit different. I actually wanted to do a little bit of editing. That way it was visually a little bit easier to sort of, take in all of this information. So comment down below what you guys think of this video. Maybe it was interesting, maybe it was helpful. I would love to hear your guys' opinions down in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, by the way. We are already at 31,000 subscribers, which is really cool. So yeah, okay. So the first deck list that we're going to be talking about today is, of course, Giratina and Darkrai. Giratina Darkrai is the most played deck of the format. It is at 10.5% meta share and rising, and that will probably continue to rise for quite some time. I expect it to be around 15+% going into this next weekend's Ursa Days tournament, which, by the way, is actually sort of a new format. A quick little news section here before we get into the video. The next tournament, Ursa Days tournament this weekend, is actually a special Ursa Days tournament, and it is a $10,000 sponsored prize pool tournament. However, it's a little bit different in its structure. So day one will be sort of a normal, bunch of Swiss rounds, right? You submit a deck list and then, everything is normal there. But day two is actually a bit different. Go check out the tournament page to get some of that information. It's basically like a dual deck format, similar to like the Worlds format, which is, kind of the side event that they're doing at the World Championships in the upcoming months. So it's really cool. Definitely go check it out. The prize pool is crazy. I highly suggest you guys go check it out. But anyway, the other thing is that the solo battle event just happened. So if you want to get that Clefable, or not Clefable, what is it? Blissey? Yeah, Blissey EX. Definitely go play that solo event, and hopefully you can pull it from the pack. So anyway, that's sort of the news segment. Let's get into the video now. That was a little bit random, but anyway, yeah, Giratina Darkrai. So it's going to rise in play coming into next weekend. It is sort of the top deck, the default deck, I should say, in Pokemon Pocket for the last few months now. It has one of the highest win rates, and it did get first place at the tournament this past weekend, which kind of makes me feel like a lot of people will end up playing it. But the cool thing about Giratina Darkrai is that at least it does have some specific decks that you can play against it that actually do have pretty quality win rates. Now, all of these deck lists are, of course, really strong into Giratina Darkrai, but the biggest upside to Giratina Darkrai is that there's not many matchups that you always lose, right? It's even the bad matchups against Giratina Darkrai are honestly pretty good, so relatively speaking. So the first deck that is really strong against Giratina Darkrai is going to be Buzzwole. And yes, Buzzwole, specifically Buzzwole and Pheromosa, traditionally does well against Giratina Darkrai. Things like Leaf Cape, and of course all of the healing that you can do can kind of negate the damage that Darkrai takes from, or the Darkrai deals from its Nightmare Aura pings. And I think the maximum that Giratina Darkrai can do in an attack without sort of, having Guzma or Red in their deck, which again they do, but if they're not playing it that turn, the most they can really do is 130 with Giratina or 150 with Giratina plus a Nightmare or a Ping. Leaf Cape brings Buzzwole up above to 170, so that requires them to have Guzma or Red, which they play two copies of. But to be fair, the upside to Buzzwole is that we are hitting for weakness and one-hit KO in Giratina if it doesn't have a Giant Cape. And then not only that, even if Buzzwole gets KO'd, we can play Lusamine and then attack turn after turn with Buzzwole, which is honestly really good, and should allow us to get that KO on things like Giratina even after it attacks, which is certainly pretty relevant. The win rate that Buzzwole has against Giratina Darkrai is 41%. So that is, or the other way around, I should say. Darkrai has a 41% matchup win rate against Buzzwole. So that is, again, I would say a really decent matchup. That's 41 to 59%. And I would say that that is one of the more significant matchups that, you know, you can play against Giratina, which I think a lot of people were actually a bit ahead of the curve on. Like Buzzwole was the second most played deck this weekend. Not only is it one of the most consistent decks in the entire game, but yeah, Buzzwole realistically is also one of the best counterplays to Darkrai. So maybe people already knew that. 41% matchup against Buzzwole, so that'll be a pretty good choice. The next deck list that you can play to have a strong matchup against Giratina and Darkrai is going to be Sylveon and Oricorio. So I know a lot of people have sort of debated for quite some time whether or not you need to tech in certain cards into Giratina Darkrai to win that matchup. Truthfully speaking, right now, Giratina Darkrai doesn't play anything specifically in the deck list to win that matchup. All they really do is play Rocky Helmets, and they're a little bit more, I guess, just leaning towards, having Rocky Helmet plus the Nightmare Aura damage to kind of get around Oricorios, and that is somewhat substantial. However, Oricorio decks do also play Sylveon, so they can attack with Oricorio, go into Sylveon, finish off a KO, and then sort of repeat that process. Theoretically speaking, Giratina Darkrai doesn't have a terrible matchup into Sylveon or Oricorio. However, that matchup is a 41.5% win rate for Giratina, so definitely still a favorable matchup for Oricorio. Again, these aren't like super crazy win rates against things like Giratina Darkrai. The options are fairly limited, I'll be 100% honest with you, but 41% is pretty good. And again, Sylveon or Oricorio does have decent matchup spreads across a lot of the decks in the metagame right now. However, what we're seeing realistically is that a lot of the new decks and a lot of the ways that people are building decks nowadays is a little bit more focused around at least, countering Oricorio to some degree. They're sort of teching in specific cards. So I would say the matchup spread right now for Sylveon or Oricorio is still decent, but it's not necessarily as good as it might have been in previous formats. Still a top deck list. 41.5% is pretty good. So I would say that that's a pretty decent counterplay to Giratina Darkrai. Last up, this is technically a deck that's strong against Giratina Darkrai, which is going to be Charizard EX with Sylveon. Now, this matchup here is interesting. It's a 45% win rate for Giratina Darkrai. So again, 45-55 is a winning matchup spread against Giratina Darkrai, but it's not really one that I would really consider to be like super substantial, right? I mean, Giratina Darkrai still winning 45% of the time against Charizard. Theoretically, it's a winning matchup, right? So I had to include it in this video, but it's really not something that I think is too crazy. The whole idea with Charizard is that, once you get it set up, you can kind of just sort of attack and then one-hit KO all of their Pokemon if they don't have a giant cape involved. But we are playing one copy of Red or Guzma, whichever one, typically in Charizard to get over that giant cape Giratina or Darkrai, which is definitely really relevant. But if you miss that opportunity and if they do find giant cape, then unfortunately getting a 2-hit KO on Giratina Darkrai oftentimes does mean that you're losing the game. So realistically, I don't think that matchup is like super great for Charizard into Giratina Darkrai, but it's better than average. So at least that is somewhat of an upside. So those are sort of the three kind of meta decks that are good into Giratina Darkrai, but there is sort of one off meta or fringe meta deck that specifically has done really well into Giratina Darkrai, and that is actually going to be Leafeon. Leafeon and Alolan Executor. We did talk about this actually on the tier list yesterday. I believe we put it into like D tier or C tier. I kind of forget already. This is not what I would consider to be a real meta deck. It's really not something that a lot of people are playing, and it's not super strong across the board into the current meta right now. However, it has Giratina Darkrai has a 23% win rate against Leafeon and Alolan Executor. And I find that to be very interesting. One of the few deck lists that anybody's playing in the format right now that specifically seems to really hard counter Giratina and Darkrai. And I think that's really cool. So I think that is definitely one of the few merits to this deck list, which otherwise probably has a pretty inconsistent spread across the rest of the metagame. Very strong matchup spread there. That is going to be a 77% win rate against Giratina Darkrai for Leafeon and Alolan Executor. So that's pretty cool. Again, if for whatever the reason Giratina Darkrai is all you're seeing, then it's technically a pretty hard counter into it. But again, it's probably not as strong as some of the other decks that we showcased here into Giratina Darkrai. But anyway, that's Giratina Darkrai. I know a lot of people are probably or I guess maybe a little bit more interested as to sort of what they can play to really counter it. There's not that many options. Like a lot of deck lists are in that sort of 47, 48, 49% win rate range against Giratina Darkrai. So some decks do have technically a winning matchup against it, but it's not anything substantial to really talk about in this video here. So that's Giratina Darkrai out of the way. Now, the second deck list that we're going to talk about how to counter is actually going to be Buzzwole. Again, I know Buzzwole is a bit of a counterplay already in the metagame, but it is one of the best decks. It is the second most played deck in the format right now, 7% of the meta share. That will likely increase. Again, we're talking about Buzzwole Pheromosa most importantly here, and it has a 55% win rate so far in this season, which is actually higher than Giratina Darkrai, which is kind of funny, right? It's seeing a little bit less play, but still one of the most successful decks, one of the best decks in the entire game. Let's talk about how we can beat Buzzwole. I know, again, most people aren't going to be sort of worried about beating Buzzwole, but it is a deck list that you're going to have to look out for because I suspect a lot of people are going to end up playing it. So the decks that are really strong against Buzzwole are going to be, most importantly, or right off the bat, is going to be Espeon. So the new Espeon deck is really, really strong. In fact, it's basically strong against every deck in the entire format except Giratina Darkrai, which is really interesting, but yeah, against Buzzwole, or Buzzwole rather, has a 34% win rate into Espeon. So that is pretty substantial. Definitely in more of a hard counter range as things like Giratina and Darkrai were with its matchup spreads. Buzzwole has some specific very hard counters, which I think is the only reason why it's not going to completely take over the metagame again. And some of these counters are very, very popular. I believe Espeon will definitely rise in play pretty dramatically. And I really think it just comes down to the fact that Espeon, or Buzzwole rather, cannot one-hit KO either Sylveon or Espeon. And Espeon's doing a ton of healing, and it's a little bit more fast-paced and a bit consistent. Going second, it's absolutely incredible. Espeon oftentimes is playing things like Silver and Red Card and Mars, so you can kind of disrupt your opponent's hand a little bit and make sure that maybe they don't have that Lucamine. And if they don't have that Lucamine, then you're definitely going to win. And even if they do, it's pretty likely that you do win, honestly. And by turn 2, we're KOing things like Pheromosa. And the cool thing here, because a big strategy with Buzzwole is sort of doing that early chip damage with Pheromosa and then coming in and finishing the game with Buzzwole, Espeon can just heal all of that. We also play Eevee Cape to heal all of that damage for multiple Pokemon. It's a really, really strong like strategy into Buzzwole. Buzzwole really does struggle against Espeon. The other decks that's really good against Buzzwole, first off, I guess, is Charizard. Charizard does have a 30, or sorry, I keep saying that backwards, but we're showing the win rate that Buzzwole has against these deck lists. I don't want people to get confused about that. Buzzwole has a 31% matchup win rate into Charizard. So Charizard, of course, something that always has countered Buzzwole pretty heavily. I think that's probably one of the original reasons why people started to play it a couple seasons ago, was primarily because it did hard counter Buzzwole and Giratina Darkrai to some extent. I think that Charizard is still a really strong deck into the format right now. We talked about that on the tier list and on Meta Monday. Things like Charizard and Solgaleo even have really decent matchup spreads into the most played decks of the format right now. The only downside to Charizard does seem to be that, of course, Oricorio kind of counters it pretty heavily. That's not a fun matchup for Charizard. But again, into Buzzwole, really, really strong. That is going to be a 69% win rate for Charizard into Buzzwole. Definitely a specific hard counterplay there. And then the last deck, I would say the best sort of counterplay to Buzzwole is going to be Flareon and Leafeon. For, again, a variety of different reasons. Flareon kind of does effectively the same thing that Buzzwole does. However, it hits for weakness and it does a lot of damage, oftentimes taking one-hit KOs. So Flareon's ability allows you to sort of conserve energies, or to, I guess, to build back up Flareon and get those energies from the discard pile. Very similar to how Buzzwole can with Lucamine. Flareon, or Buzzwole into Flareon, has a 22% win rate, which is honestly really, really, really bad. That's going to be a 78% win rate for Flareon into that matchup. Flareon here having a really good matchup into Buzzwole is important because I think, again, Buzzwole in all of its different forms, whether you're playing the Pheromosa version or not, does make it probably one of the most popular decks of the format. And I think one of the biggest upsides to Flareon in this meta right now is that it actually has a really decent matchup spread into Buzzwole decks specifically. So I would say that the number one most significant counter of Buzzwole is going to be Flareon. Like I said, not many people are necessarily thinking how to counter Buzzwole. They're mostly playing Buzzwole in a sense of like, okay, I'm playing Buzzwole to counter these specific decks, but you know, the counter meta ends up being the meta, right? If enough people play it, and I think we've already seen that with Buzzwole, so it's important to know the deck lists that are really strong into it. The third deck that we're going to talk about how to counter is going to actually be like the counter deck, which is against Silvally or Oricorio. Becoming probably a lot more common now. There's multiple ways to play Sylveon or Oricorio, which means that on Limitless, like the actual, you know, categorizations of the deck lists will be spread out, meaning more people, or less people rather, will be playing that specific archetype, which is why, you know, Sylveon or Oricorio right now is only 5% of the meta share, but there's the Pichu Sylveon deck, which is also 2% of the meta share. So if you add them all up, these sort of Oricorio deck lists when you're playing Sylveon kind of add up to be about, you know, 8 or 9% of the meta share, which is pretty significant. And the Sylveon or Oricorio decks have a 53% win rate, so they are some of the best, most dominant decks in the entire game. let's talk about which decks are strong against Silvally Oricorio. The first one is going to be Buzzwole. Yeah, so Buzzwole actually ends up being pretty good into Oricorio, mainly just because it's really good into Silvally specifically because we can heal a bunch, we got a ton of HP, we can kind of out-sustain and out-survive things like Oricorio, but we have a lot of options to KO Oricorio. We've gotten Kartana, even Pheromosa can do some chip damage, and then Celesteela on a coin flip, which we can set up with Lucamine, can one-hit KO Oricorio. So Buzzwole traditionally has actually had a really good matchup into Silvally Oricorio, and that matchup for Silvally Oricorio into Buzzwole is 36%. So a really not great matchup for Silvally Oricorio. Buzzwole here is interesting. When we take a look at the matchup spreads for Silvally Oricorio, it's actually a lot more interesting than it has been, I think, in recent weeks. Really specifically counters a variety of deck lists, but almost sort of gets countered by some other deck lists. It has a very volatile matchup spread. The next deck list, which is really strong into Silvally Oricorio, is actually just going to be Tapu Koko Arceus and Oricorio, which is sort of the other way that people are playing Oricorio right now. There's really only two versions. So you have the Silvally version, and then you have sort of that Tapu Koko Arceus kind of combo. I talked about this a couple times last season, that this was effectively a deck that operated very similarly to Silvally Oricorio, but did well into that matchup. And I think that it always deserves to see more play. It's just never going to be the more common way that people are running Oricorio, you know, which I find that to be very, very interesting. So Silvally Oricorio has a 39% win rate so far against Arceus and Tapu Koko, which again also typically plays Oricorio. And I think that really just comes down to the fact that Arceus and Tapu Koko beat Silvally in the head-to-head, and then of course the rest of the deck is just Oricorio versus Oricorio. So I don't think that that's too big of a surprise here. Again, I do believe that the matchup data and everything that sort of I guess showcases to us is that if we want to play Oricorio, we should probably play that version just because it's actually better against the other version of Oricorio, which I think is kind of really, really interesting. I don't know how else to really say that. 61% win rate for Arceus Tapu Koko into Silvally Oricorio, which is really, really fun. And then the next deck list here that is really strong into Silvally Oricorio is actually Espeon. Yeah, and we're going to talk about Espeon a number of times in this video, mainly just because Espeon has such a good matchup spread into so many different deck lists. The win rate for Silvally Oricorio when they're playing against Espeon is only 30%. So Espeon literally wins 70% of the time in that matchup, and that is very, very significant. I think one of the biggest upsides to that deck list, you can play the baby Sylveon or the non-EX Sylveon. You can play the non-EX Espeon. We can basically entirely just stall indefinitely against Oricorio with double Espeon EXs and just sort of healing, retreating, and then healing. We have EV Bag. It's actually kind of crazy. That matchup to me, it kind of feels like an auto win, even though it's 70-30. It feels probably a lot better than that, honestly, when I'm playing that matchup. So anyway, yeah, Espeon, just honestly a really good counter. The strongest deck in the game currently right now in my mind in terms of its pace and its consistency. Espeon's going to see a lot more play as time goes on, so a little bit scary for things like Silvally Oricorio. The Flareon deck and or not the Flareon deck rather, but things like Buzzwole and things like Espeon are going to continue to see a lot of play, which is a little bit scary for Silvally Oricorio, which I think is very, very interesting. But anyway, that's how we counter Silvally Oricorio. Those are the strongest matchups right there. The next one, let's talk about Sylveon and Greninja. So I've kind of speaked downly about this deck a little bit, but when we take a look at the overall metadata, it is still the fourth most played deck currently right now, and it has a 51% win rate. So I wanted to include it in this video. I know a lot of people are still playing this deck. Currently, it's 6.5% of the meta share, and I think that is kind of pretty relevant, honestly. I mean, Sylveon, Greninja, and Giratina was the top deck of last format. I think it'll probably be on the decline. People will probably play other decks in favor of this deck list, things like Flareon, Leafeon, and Espeon Sylveon. But this is still going to be a deck that's floating around, and it's important to know which decks are strong against it. So the matchups that this deck really does struggle with, most importantly here, is going to be Giratina Darkrai. I think that's the number one thing holding this deck back right now, especially early on in this metagame. Giratina Darkrai very, very popular here. I think the main reason here, honestly, is just that Giratina Darkrai can just sort of set up and then sweep your deck, and there's really not much you can do about that. It's just a little bit more of a consistent strategy. You can KO Greninjas, you can KO Sylveons, and you can KO Giratinas there, and it just sort of ends up being a little bit more of a consistent option that just ends up winning in the head-to-head for whatever the reason. It's kind of hard to put my finger on it. It just wins. Like, for whatever the reason, Sylveon Greninja doesn't love that matchup, and it has a 35% win rate into Giratina Darkrai, so a 65% win rate for Giratina Darkrai in that matchup is actually a lot higher than I ever expected it to be, but that just goes to show how strong Giratina Darkrai is. The next deck that's really strong into Greninja and Sylveon is going to be Arceus and Tapu Koko. That actually has a 59% win rate. So 59 to 41% there against Sylveon and Greninja. Again, a really common deck list that probably doesn't see enough play. Again, Arceus and Tapu Koko is actually just really, really good. Its matchup spreads are very, very impressive. And I think it deserves to see more play. But anyway, that's one deck list that does really good into Greninja Sylveon. And then the last deck list, again, which is pretty funny, is Espeon. And Espeon here, absolutely dominant in the matchup. In fact, Sylveon Greninja only wins against Espeon 21% of the time. And again, this is something that I really said early on, which is why I believe Greninja Sylveon is really trending downward. I think that there's just new deck lists and old deck lists that are becoming more popular that are just really strong into it. It's not as friendly, it doesn't have as good of a time in this new metagame here. Espeon is really, I think, the core deck list that has changed things the most, and will continue to change things the most as it kind of sees more play and as time goes on here. Again, 21% win rate into Espeon is quite bad. That's 21 to 79. That's a massive, massive deal here. And Espeon's going to skyrocket in play rate, which means that Sylveon Greninja is probably going to have a really, really bad time for sure. So another big reason why we should be playing Espeon right now, especially if a lot of people continue to play Greninja and Sylveon and Giratina. Okay, next up is going to be Flareon Leafeon. So this deck list did really well at Ursa Days, and I think that it is actually one of the better decks in the entire game. On the tier list, I kind of debated putting it in S tier. I put Espeon and Giratina and Darkrai in S tier, but if there was a third deck to put in there, it would either be Buzzwole or Flareon and Leafeon, but it'll continue to rise and play. I think it'll probably settle between, the 4th and 5th most played decks of this format right now, and I think that's something that is very, very important. We have to understand our matchup spreads into Flareon and Leafeon if it ever ends up really taking over. It's people's fan favorite deck list because it is really cool and it's really fun and creative. So I think it'll probably rise and play pretty significantly. But how do we counterplay? What are the decks that are strong into Flareon and Leafeon? So Charizard does have a really, by the way, Flareon, Leafeon, currently 4% of the meta share, but definitely going to rise up, and it has a 53% win rate so far. So anyway, the number one deck that's good against Flareon is Charizard, right? So again, Charizard does beat it 60% of the time. Very similar, I would say, to other sort of tempo decks that don't necessarily do a ton of damage or have a ton of HP. Charizard just can kind of set up and then 1-hit KO all of your Pokemon. Traditionally, Charizard does have a pretty good matchup. We can also play Lily to heal off the damage from, that Leafeon early in the game. That's just very substantial, I think, is kind of really what it comes down to. Charizard is Charizard, and Charizard will also probably rise in play for sure, which I think is pretty funny. But yeah, 40% against Charizard isn't very good. And again, into Tapu Koko Arceus, only 36%, right? So Tapu Koko and Arceus doing well yet again into something like Flareon and Leafeon really showcases how strong that Tapu Koko Arceus Oricorio deck is. Probably the biggest sleeper in terms of its counter meta potential in the format right now. And yeah, only 36% win rate into it, which is honestly a very, very substantial counter there. And then, of course, actually one of the deck lists that is still good against Flareon and Leafeon is going to be Greninja Sylveon, like we just talked about. So while Espeon counters Sylveon and Greninja and Sylveon counterplays Leafeon and Flareon. So sort of the evolution decks have this really cool sort of rock, paper, scissors stuff going around here. 29% win rate against it, which is honestly kind of crazy. That's a significant counterplay. So I didn't really realize that. I mean, Leafeon and Flareon saw a lot of play last format, even though Sylveon and Greninja was the most played deck. So I find that to be very interesting. 29 to, what is that? 71%. So 71% win rate for, Greninja, Sylveon into Flareon is really interesting. That's a really substantial matchup there. I guess it just becomes, I don't know why necessarily that's the case. I guess it's just a more consistent win condition in that sense. I don't know. That's certainly really, I guess Giratina does sort of carry things a little bit, but also just sort of the Greninja ping. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about there. Very good win rate for Greninja into Flareon. So anyway, the next deck list that we're going to talk about is Espeon, and I wanted to spend some actual real time talking about Espeon because currently right now it's only 4% of the current meta share so far this season, but this will inevitably end up being one of the most played decks because it does have a 58% win rate so far, by far the highest out of any of the most played decks in the format. So it'll go from about 4%, probably it'll skyrocket within the next few weeks. It will end up being one of the most played decks. So it's important to know, how are we going to beat Espeon? Because it seemingly does have a really good matchup spread into most of the decks in the format and is just one of the most fast-paced, consistent decks that you could possibly play right now. A 58% win rate is pretty crazy. So the three deck lists that do the best against Espeon, first off, is going to be Crobat. So I know Crobat, people aren't super high on it, but I do think Crobat will probably find a pretty significant niche in the metagame right now, being specifically really good against Espeon. It has a 58% win rate, which is pretty good. I mean, 58% against Espeon is enough for us to really look at Crobat in a different light. Crobat's not something that I'm actually talking about today in terms of how to counter it, because it's going to decline in play, and there's a lot of decks that are actually good against Crobat, but Crobat specifically is pretty good against Espeon there, 58% win rate. Next up is going to be Guzzlord. Yes, Guzzlord is sort of the top sort of aggressive dark type deck, and I would say that this is probably one of the most substantial matchups to beat Espeon, and I think it's a big reason why Guzzlord will probably enter into this metagame a little bit more so than Crobat will. It does better into Espeon. That is actually going to be a 39% win rate against Guzzlord, which would be a 61% win rate for Guzzlord into Espeon. That is just really substantial. Again, there's really not many decks that can beat Espeon consistently, and it really is just the dark type decks, because hitting for weakness is really the only way to get around that substantial amount of healing that Espeon does. Guzzlord has a lot of HP, it can discard energies. It's just sort of doing a lot of extra damage because of hitting for weakness on Espeon, and that is definitely really, really important. Things like Naganadel, which you're seeing play in Guzzlord, is probably the number one specific reason, right? It's sort of a really aggressive card. Good going first, and again, hitting for weakness, which is just all really important stuff. And if you do go second, you can still sort of KO that EV before they evolve, or go first rather, which is really relevant, right? So I think the pace, hitting for weakness, and of course Guzzlord in general being strong into that Psychic type matchup is really good for Guzzlord. So again, a 61% win rate into Espeon, definitely substantial. But the number one deck against Espeon is going to be Giratina Darkrai. So again, I think the only reason why Giratina Darkrai won't see specific hard counterplay and kind of fall a lot more so out of the format right now is that it just so happens to be the only deck, or one of the only decks, that is really strong against Espeon, which again, in my mind, is sort of the new top deck in the game. So I think that's going to keep Giratina Darkrai in the metagame, and it will likely just sort of fall into a nice triangulation at the top, a nice little rock, paper, scissors between Giratina Darkrai, Espeon, or maybe Flareon, Leafeon, or maybe Buzzwole. I think that those are going to end up being kind of the top decks, or maybe even Savali or Oricorio, right? There's a lot of decks that could be that third deck in that rock, paper, scissors, but the two top decks are Giratina Darkrai. So unless something really separates itself and sort of inserts itself into that rock, paper, scissors formulation there, it's really just going to be Espeon beating every deck except for Giratina Darkrai, and then a bunch of decks beating Giratina Darkrai, except Giratina Darkrai beats Espeon, you know? So it's going to be an interesting thing at the top of the metagame. Giratina Darkrai, or Espeon into Giratina Darkrai has a 36% win rate, so that is pretty substantial. However, I think there's a lot of things that we can change about Espeon to change that win rate or improve it pretty dramatically. I think that right now, Espeon is not only super popular, but a lot of people don't really know how to, I guess, best play that matchup into Giratina Darkrai. Going second and going first, I actually feel like there's a lot of ways to win that matchup, and I think that silver is kind of the key there. But we'll see how time goes on, how much that matchup actually improves for Espeon, because if Espeon can get that matchup closer and closer to 50%, then it's just going to run away with this format, because there's really nothing else that's, you know, other than Guzzlord, I guess, is that's going to significantly beat Espeon most of the time. So yeah, Giratina Darkrai, the number one counter to Espeon, for sure, I would say currently right now, but I don't know if that's necessarily going to continue much, which is kind of crazy. There it is. So that's the video. We kept it around 30 minutes, which was my goal. I understand this video might have been somewhat sort of like hard to digest. Like whenever we really get into the metadata, and again, there's been 26 tournaments, 3,500 players, and almost 9,000 matches. So we have a pretty substantial, I guess, sample size already of this metagame and which decks are strong against which decks. We all have to make sort of assumptions and presumptions as to which decks will rise to the top as time goes on, which is, again, something that we talked about in this video. But again, we have to have a good understanding of what decks are good against the most popular decks. That way we know what to do if they ever start to take over the metagame, and that's what this video was really all about. So I apologize. Hopefully this format here and the editing that we do for this video made it maybe a little bit easier to understand. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but comment down below what you guys think of this particular video format. Maybe it was helpful, you know, I don't know. I'm just trying to help you guys. That's really all we do on the channel, is do our best to try to help you guys as much as possible. One thing that I am going to do, I didn't have time to do it today, but I'll probably create like a chart, like an actual chart of all of sort of the decks and their matchups against each other. That way we can update it from week to week, and then sort of at a glance, if you ever wanted to refer to it, you could find technically the matchup spreads for any deck against really any of the most popular decks. So I'll be working on that. So stay tuned. That'll be down in the Discord. I'll probably post that for the people in the Discord. And it probably will be a pretty significant advantage. So if you guys want to go ahead and join the Discord, it's down in the link in the description. The link is down in the description below. So definitely come and join. We've got almost 1,000 people in the Discord. It's a really cool place to come and hang out. But anyway, guys, let's get out of here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned. We got more content coming on the channel. And yeah, hopefully this video was helpful to you guys. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, all right, guys, peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, bye.